Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. As we entered the 8th month of the war, the unstoppable advance of Ukraine forced Vladimir Putin to declare mobilization. However, this could be one of Putin's biggest mistakes against both the Russian army and the Russian people. There is a great turmoil in Russia, the Kremlin is shaking, the angry Russians are starting a great uprising against the regime. Russian men fleeing the Kremlin's declaration of mobilization gathered on the borders of Finland and Georgia. Russian men are looking for ways to escape Russia and Putin's mobilization. Airline tickets and train tickets are sold out in Russia. There are hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing to Turkey, Georgia, Finland, Azerbaijan, and various European countries. The EU accepted Russians who fled Russia by refusing to fight in Ukraine, but on the condition that they would not return. The people remaining in Russia have taken to the streets and rebellions are breaking out. At least 40 Russian provinces and autonomous republics such as Dagestan, Chechnya, Buryatia, and Siberia. By this time, around 5,000 Russian military buildings and outposts were set on fire. Angry and enraged Russians are attacking even Russian commanders in military headquarters and refuse to go to the senseless war in Ukraine and die for Putin's egos. The offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces against the Russian army continues. The Ukrainian army, which showed its dominance on the battlefield, started to take the Donbas region into its palm. Russia has exhausted its army with unsuccessful attacks in the Donbas region. Russian troops launched an offensive against the Ukrainian army in the southern part of the Donbas region yesterday. The attack launched by the Russians was caught in the defensive shield that the Ukrainian army had built in this region. In Bakhmut, one of the Donetsk cities, the Russian army was triangulated by the Ukrainian valiants and left under heavy attack. Some of the Russian army units managed to escape from this offensive fire. The rest continued to respond until the ammunition ran out. The Russian army, which suffered serious losses as a result of the conflict, had to retreat. The Ukrainian army, taking advantage of the fact that the ammunition deficiencies of the Russian troops were at the extreme stage, began to increase their advance in the east and south of Ukraine. Especially in the southern front, the Ukrainian army came under heavy attack on the Russian troops. The southern operation planned by the Ukrainian generals continued without slowing down. The Russian army started airstrikes to avoid defeat in the southern region. The Russian army, which carried out harassment shots with long-range missiles, was also preparing plans to withdraw from this region. Precautionary retreats, as the Kremlin administration put it, have now come to the fore among the war strategies of the Russian army. The Russian army again came under fire from the civilian population in this region in order to deflect the Ukrainian pressure and distract the Ukrainian army. After the Russian army's attacks on innocent Ukrainian civilians, Himars long-range missiles, the most favorite equipment of the Ukrainian armed forces, started to light up the skies. The Ukrainian army also supported the full-fledged missile attacks from the ground. Himars artillery units destroyed the Russian army's bases and ammunition depots in this region, and most importantly 2 Russian S-300 missile systems. 2 S-300 surface-to-air missile systems, which would cost the Russian army enormously, have become completely unusable. The Russian S-300 was completely humiliated in Ukraine. The S-300 and even the S-400 air defense systems, highly praised by Putin, were ineffective against Himars' unstoppable missiles. With the purchase of AGM-88 anti-radiation missiles by the Ukrainian Air Force at the beginning of August, the possibility of Russian air defense systems intercepting the Ukrainian missiles completely disappeared. As a result of these attacks, the Russian army began to withdraw towards the borders of the region. While retreating, they still remained under heavy fire from the Ukrainian warriors. During the conflict, Russian troops were able to carry out only 5 airstrikes against the Ukrainian army. As a result of the attack carried out by the Smerch multi-launch rocket system and the Uragan MLRS, the Russian troops who took the lives of the innocent civilians of Ukraine cost the life of 1 person from the innocent civilians of Ukraine rather than the soldiers of the Ukrainian army, and 7 people were injured. The Russian soldiers, who could not even get their heads from the front, could not make any significant progress from the land. While the Russian troops continued to withdraw, the Ukrainian heroic missile and artillery units continued to target the Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers who had withdrawn to the Kakova Bridge were cornered in this region. Ukrainian fighters again bombarded the Russians in this region. As a result of this sudden operation carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces, the Russian troops began to flee in a devastated state. The costs of the operation to the Russian army are very serious. The invading troops deployed an MSTA-S self-propelled howitzer, 2 S-300 surface-to-air missile systems, a target elimination and guidance radar, an EBO-M mobile radar system for detecting aerodynamic and ballistic objects, 2 120mm Taud mortars, and 3 lost his armored vehicle. The loss of life of the Russian army at the end of this conflict exceeded 20. The Russians, who were seriously injured by the sudden operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces, lost their power to launch a counterattack in this region. At the moment, the Russian army is holding a retreating position only to be able to escape from the areas. The morale of the soldiers in the Russian army has dropped drastically. In addition to the defeats in a row, Russia has serious problems in sending additional soldiers to replace the lost soldiers. That's why Russian troops are trying to resist with a limited number of soldiers in this region with their limited equipment. After the defeat on the southern front, the Russian administration turned its target to its navy on the Black Sea coast. In order to increase the strength of the navy, the Russian armed forces added 4 more ships in addition to the 10 Russian warships located behind the Cape Tarhankut. Among these warships in the Russian Navy, 5 warships carrying more than 30 caliber cruise missiles drove attention. In addition to these 5 ships that the Russians trust the most, 1 large landing ship is kept ready for war in this region. The Russian administration continues to have difficulties in carrying out the attacks it planned. Frustrated on the southern front, the Russians lost their dominance in this region as well. The advantage of the region has now passed to the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian administration. The Russian administration continues to have difficulties in carrying out the attacks it planned. Frustrated on the southern front, the Russians lost their dominance in this region as well. The advantage of the region has now passed to the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian administration. Ukrainian President Zelensky made a statement after his victories in the south. Leader Zelensky intimated that Russian soldiers saying, "Escape for your life." The Ukrainian leader added that the path to amnesty is still open for Russian soldiers who want to surrender. After these statements, the response from the Russian administration was not late, despite the fact that the Russian army was devastated and disorganized and suffered heavy defeats. Due to the lack of ammunition and other resources, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stated that Russia is advancing within its plans and all targets will be achieved. Peskov's words may indicate that the Russians have a plan to get out of this difficult situation, because Russian leader Vladimir Putin stated in his latest statement that he would deploy high-ranking officers and other soldiers in his army to the Crimea region. It is useful to repeat that Crimea may become a war center where this very serious conflict, heavy missiles and artillery fires will take place in the future. Both leaders still have no intention of giving up on Crimea. Peskov's statements were followed by the mobilization declaration of Russian President Vladimir Putin. However, this statement did not cause the Russian army to reach its goal. On the contrary, it triggered a huge uprising and internal conflicts within Russia. Right now, the Kremlin is shaken by the shock of protests and riots, and these seem more like aftershocks. We will see the results together.